Because the United States is in many ways so richly. So we are looking at a U.S. map by race in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. There are white supremacists. The only place you're really looking at as being a possible viable place to create a white ethnic state would be the Pacific Northwest, in rural, and you're going to be targeting those rural areas. So they start to move up there into those areas. So you're going to watch as this class goes on. You're going to hear about Ruby Ridge, it happens up in Iowa, up in the Pacific Northwest. All of those, a lot of those incidents will occur in places like that. Waco, many lots of white supremacists, but Branch Davidian was religious. It wasn't about white supremacists. It was not happened in Texas. But it became very important for white supremacists. He became part of their ideology. Tyrannical government was going too far. So in this World Congress meeting in 1983, they declare on the U.S. government. This is the moment when they go from we're doing vigilante violence, the violence that we're going to be engaging in, like the Ku Klux Klan believed they were doing violence on behalf of the government, but they were going out and killing black people, lynching black people. They believed that they were supporting the government on some level, that they were supporting their local white elites or things like that. Here, they're making a express shift to terrorism and a war against the U.S. government. So previously it was violence on behalf of the state. Now it is a shift to a battle against the state. And they believe that behind the government is a Zionist occupational government, or SAW, that is really the Jews that are behind, and that it's the Jews that are doing this. And we need to define revolution. So what do we mean by revolution? When we talk about revolution, we're not talking about like, any liberal Bernie Sanders. We're not revolution. Here, we're talking about a overthrow or a fundamental change in the social structures of society. So revolution isn't just about taking, it is about changing the fundamental social structures of society. That's what the social scientists define revolution in the 20th century. So we like to think that the American Revolution was a revolution. That's revolution. There wasn't that much revolutionary about revolution. The only thing we really did was say, hey, British, no, you can't control us. We are our own thing. Well, were the people who were rich before the revolution still rich after? Yes. The British colonies had their own forms of self-government, basically, before and after. Why were we still organized into a constitutional convention? Why were we going to assembly halls, debating how to rule ourselves? Because for the most part, and the British Empire didn't rule yourself. A whole series of reasons why that was the case. That was part of the uniqueness of the British Empire. So what did we really societally change? George Washington goes from being an officer for the British Army, a high-ranking officer for the British Army, to being president of the United States, right? We really socially changed. Now, there were other social changes, but there was no big radical social change. That's changing government. Let me give you an example of a radical social change. Bolshevik Revolution, 1977. Essentially, all private property is eliminated. That's the great social change. That's a fundamental change in the structure of the society. Cuban Revolution. Essentially all private property is eliminated or nearly so. And it's basically illiterate goes to nearly 100% in like 5 to 10 years. Mexican Revolution. You do a Catholic church in Mexico. Holy crap. They literally have rebellions called the Cristero Rebellion. Yeah. With the Japanese revolution that basically Indians moving from towns like the shell government where they're storing the actually really dead. Oh, that is a really good question, and I just don't know that history. I'm not saying this. That is a really good question, and I'm not well enough versed on that. I also need to watch the show. I'm not well enough versed on that to really speak to that. But the big revolutions in the 20th century that everyone talks about was the revolution in communist China, major social change in the same Soviets, Cuban Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. We had massive expropriation of oil in Mexico. You had a growth in war exception. This is home property. And they had a rebellion. And instead of a rebellion against that, that's kind of like under the compromise. Uh, there were fundamental radical changes in the social structures in Mexico. Notice that these revolutions, oftentimes, a lot of people die in these processes. A lot of people die. I don't understand of the Anglo-Saxon revolutionary tradition. We don't really do that. We do slow social change. So in 1688, they had the Glorious Revolution in England. And essentially, it's kind of like this law where one world family, displaces another living. But it establishes more inherent property rights. John Locke writes the Second Treatise of Government about it. Life, liberty, and equality sound familiar? Yeah, we played your eyes totally. It's cool. It's cool though. So the Glorious Revolution, so the American Revolution, yeah, there's this war, but for the most part, that's not really a revolution. Whereas the bloody social change in America, truly have bloody social changes. Americans did. That's interesting. But it ends slavery. That's a fundamental social change. If you look at how critical slavery was to the American Southern economy. And it was essentially they were maintaining a neo-feudal structure. That's a fundamental social change. That's our bloody extinction. For the most part, though, how does our social change occur? Because that's a pretty basic social change. Let's remember about the civil rights movement occurred. Was it bloody and violent? Did tens of thousands of people get murdered in the streets? How did they occur? Tell me about civil rights. Oh, come on. Everybody needs to come on. No, really, you've done a high school history. Tell me what your thoughts. Tell me about how the civil rights movement played out. How was it? I told you about some of the critical institutions. We got something here. We got a student from who's leading the NAACP on campus. So there was partly a legal strategy, right? That was a component of the civil rights movement. There was nonviolent protests. Ooh, let's say something. Sorry. Nonviolent protests. You had peaceful protests. You had civil disobedience. Uh, was there violence against those nonviolent protests at times? In Selma, they got guys riding in with batons on horses, knocking people's heads. But in a democratic society and a more liberal democratic society, when I say liberal, I don't mean like liberal conservative. No, I'm talking about liberalism, the bigger concept of democracy, inclusive institutions, and things like that. What happens when you see images of your fellow countrymen getting their heads knocked by the state? How do you feel about that? If it's drugs, the government should not put that in our way, and there's a reaction to that. Why did Mahatma Gandhi succeed in India? There was peaceful resistance. Mahatma Gandhi, peaceful resistance. Who were they colonized by? Who was India colonized by? British. The British were a democratic society. And when they got word, the Colombians were going out knocking heads, peaceful protesters. They said, you know what? Enough is enough. We can't do this anymore. We're not going to do this. But here's the thing. There's another movie. You get it? Oh, God, this Netflix movie about the Nazis is number 24. Anybody watch it? I think it's number 24. It is? You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Number 24 is about a guy who's a Norwegian who becomes an intelligence operative for the Norwegian government and Norwegian resistance against the Nazis. And a student after the war asked him, why didn't you do nonviolent resistance to the Nazis? What would the Nazis do to you if you did nonviolent resistance? They just killed you. So where does nonviolent resistance work and where does it fail? Where does nonviolent resistance work and where does it fail? Yeah, if you've got a hardcore totalitarian or authoritarian government you're dealing with, nonviolent resistance is the stupidest strategy ever. It is like, why don't you just kill me now? Why don't you just denounce yourself? But nonviolent resistance against Britain in the 1940s, nonviolent resistance against the U.S. government in the 1960s. Resistance against the French was oftentimes by the Algerians, was oftentimes violent. The Algerians set up a really interesting system. You should always know how to run an insurgency. You should always know how to run a counterinsurgency. So here's how the Algerian resistance did. They wanted to get the French out in the 1950s. So what did they do? They set up a system where if you're part of the resistance, you operate in a two-man cell, or man or woman cell. What's your name? Carter. Okay, so me and Carter are in a cell together. Carter, we have a rule. If I'm not in contact with you for 24 hours, I'm burned. So me and Carter always in contact with each other, 24 hours. It's just me and Carter. The French realized that they were running a 24-hour system. How do you get actionable intelligence out of somebody in a 24-hour system? You need to compromise them or get information within 17 hours. How can you get information out of somebody in 17 hours? You start cutting them up. You start torturing. The French did some really nasty torture. And the French Republic found out what their government was doing to control Algeria. And what do you think the French people thought when they realized that they were cutting people open alive? Torture. They said to them, stop this. Let it go. Let them be free. We're done. It works on democratic and free peoples. It will not work on a totalitarian regime. You better hide, pretend to like the regime, smile at everybody's face, and shoot them down. That's the only strategy. That's a resistance in service. That strategy does not work. That strategy will work against totalitarian regimes. A nonviolent strategy might work quite well if you're dealing with a democratic or free society. It won't work on the Nazis. It won't work on the Soviets. They're perfectly willing to kill them. They're going to control what their public thinks. Yeah. Yeah. And all that. All right. Yeah. It's too bad they changed your education here. I used to teach more security class. I had some lead called Border Country. It was this wonderful book. One of the things that illustrated was American society in those early days. The tax structure was fundamentally different than it is today. It wouldn't, and we can't go back. But it was entirely based on taxes, tariffs, and fees and force. There's nothing going on. All of revenue. The U.S. Treasury Department effectively controlled the courts. They controlled taxation. What did that incentivize? If you tax things massively at ports of entry, what are you incentivized? What? What? No. You're just incentivizing the ports. It's taxing them. You still want something from abroad, so how are you going to get it? Illegally, smugglers. Our country was founded by smugglers, baby. Smuggler nation. You're in there, so you have one reading. Americans were smugglers. That's what we did. That's what we were avoiding the British tariffs. And we turned some of those smugglers into privateers. But essentially, pirates and called them legal, right? At some point, we passed a social tremendous and we have an income tax. And the income tax means that we're taxing our domestic population. And we're not dependent on international trade for those things. There's a whole series of reasons we can't go back to that. I think Donald Trump thinks we can go back to that world. I just respectfully disagree. That's not realistic. That's like saying I want to go back to the gold standard. Like you'll see old people say stuff like that, and you're like, okay, you need to stop watching those commercials on Fox News that rip you off. Like gold is a commodity like any others. Actually, the gold standard is one of the causes of the Great Depression. Here's what happens. When people started to get nervous about what was going on in the American economy and the dollar was backed by gold, they started to panic. They started buying up gold and trying to get rid of their dollars. The dollars started to worthless, because everybody wanted to have gold instead. And it turned into a run on the bank. And FDR had to do fireside chat, calm everybody down, raise this, and that's when we ended the gold standard. The gold standard was a nightmare. So whenever people talk about like, oh, let's go back to the gold standard so we can control inflation, there's way more value in the world. I mean, like, you can't have value in the world based on some fixed commodity. You're already on computers. It's a secret that did not exist 30 years ago. We can't get limited by, oh, we got this amount of gold and only that has value. We have done that. Right? Like that would be deflationary. That would just limit our economic growth. We're way that and we're really on that. We're also working on growth activity. You're gonna have taxes and like you just have a giant smuggler nation. It doesn't. We want a strong nation. I want to spend spending cuts. I want to spend spending increases. You're the whole purpose the warmonger. Sorry. No, I want more defense spending so that we can deter our enemies in the future without having it. The active skill is not to win in battle, but to take all that is under the sun without having to fight. Sun Tzu, or not that stuff. Okay, so there's this meeting up in the Pacific Northwest where the white power movement shifts to becoming enemies of the state, essentially, and targeting the state, deciding they want to attack the state. Early adopters of computer networks. They adopt leaderless resistance, so they have cell-style organizations. They know that leaders will be targeted. They will have less visibility and it will be harder to identify a chain of command. So how do you control an organization if everything's super decentralized? You have to create common narratives. One of the ways you can create a common narrative is by writing a book like the Turner. The Turner Diaries is about a white supremacist who decides he wants to overthrow the government, and he builds a truck bomb and goes and parks that truck bomb and blows up a giant federal government facility in hopes that act of violence will spark a larger white supremacist race war and revolution. Sound familiar? Oklahoma City bomber back in 1992, just to sell that book, the Turner Diaries, at many nations. Oklahoma City bomber. Chesapeake Bay is a little more tenuous than that, right? And this is what Baloo gets into. And she's going to have an extensive discussion on exactly that toward the end of her book. She ends her book with the Oklahoma City Law in 1995. Timothy McVeigh, he'd been in the U.S. Army. He was a Bronze Star leader for valor in the Persian Gulf. He was a member of the Michigan militia, which was kind of this like quasi anti-government militia in Michigan. He had said some racist things in response to some soldiers at the base having black power t-shirts. He put on a white power t-shirt. Was that him trying to troll them? Baloo takes into his history and said, well, he'd spent some time in a place called Eloquent City. And Eloquent City was associated with white supremacy terrorists, so it was kind of all part of this milieu. And what she's describing is there's this milieu. There's almost this plausible deniability. I'm not a white supremacist, I'm just hanging out with Michigan militia. We met a couple of black guys, right? But like, there's a lot of overlap, right? And so that's what she's getting at. I'm not saying everybody in the Michigan militia is racist, right? But there's a lot, you find a lot of racists inside of Michigan militia. So, judge for yourself. Read her book and make your judgment for yourself. And Vietnam played a major part of this cultural narrative. So one cultural narrative is, there's a bunch of cultural narratives we'll talk about. One of them is, how do you get this kind of symbolic leadership to lead a decentralized movement in the same direction? And that's essentially what Osama bin Laden was doing after the 9/11 attacks. He couldn't do operational. He would put periodic letters out to the entire network, and they would become public. And so that's why the CIA analysts who are studying these organizations that take on these decentralized leadership structures say, you absolutely should believe everything they are saying publicly, because they have no mechanism to communicate secret. So what they're saying publicly is how they're directing the network. They're providing a visionary leadership, the individual cells, like me and Carter, Algeria. The individual cells will hear that and go, okay, they want us to target shopping malls. Okay, we're going to plan on shopping, whatever it is. They are absolutely speaking publicly, and you should take what they're saying seriously in what they say publicly. When they say they want to create a white ethnic state, take them seriously. That's what they want. They're just telling you what they want, no matter how unrealistic it sounds. War. Now, I think we covered this. This slide will not be seen. Okay, here we go. Their anti-communism message is going to be less salient. At this point, they're going to start targeting the federal government. They claim to be inspired by communist organization style. Okay. They say, well, the communists organize themselves in these cell styles. That's how we are organizing ourselves. I want you to be very intellectually clear. A lot of these groups, they will do a lot of false flagging, and they'll try to muddle the narrative. The Nazis, for example, called themselves passionate socialists. This was not because they were socialists. Their activity in the 1920s, their political activity was to go to a bar, get drunk, try to provoke a socialist, provoke a fight. That was their early 1920s political activity. That was a branded thing that they did to try to get workers involved in their political party. If you think the Nazis were socialists like communists, you are deeply confused. You will hear people repeat that over and over again. Their idea of a good time was to go and beat up communists. Let's be very clear about that. It was a branding thing that they did. They weren't actually socialists. Now, they did do command and control over the economy. Fascism, socialism. Key difference, right? Ideology and price mechanism. The treatment of property and the price mechanism. I.e., socialists want to control prices. Fascists have the advantage of the price mechanism. That's why fascists in many ways are more dangerous than communists. Communists will collapse in on themselves. Authoritarian regimes, in general, even if they're fascist, they have the advantage of the price mechanism. They can run it. That's actually what makes them more scary. They'll actually run an economy, whereas the communists don't last. You need to be king. Yeah, that being said, if you ever get a chance, read the book Why Nations Fail by Asimoglu and Robinson. They won the Nobel Prize for the overall body of work. Authoritarian regimes tend to not have inclusive institutions. Because they're not inclusive, they engage in rent seeking. What they do is they get money and then they just pay off just a few elites to buy off everybody else or they control society. But that's not a very good way to run an economy. If you notice, the US economy will grow by $2 trillion every 2 years. I hope that continues. You look at the Russian economy, this vast landmass, and it's only $2 trillion total. It's kind of a joke. It's kind of embarrassingly bad economic performance. I mean, you could put Vladimir Putin in the fascist category, in the authoritarian, totalitarian, and this war has pushed them more into that. Because during warfare, they were able to crack down more on free speech, anybody who was protesting the government, everybody who protested the government, jail, all kinds of stuff happening. Right? So the question was he starting this war because he didn't want to Ukraine? Starting this war because he wanted to kill Palestine. Domestic politics can sometimes lead to different foreign policies externally. Okay, so these guys claim to be inspired by a communist organization, but they're anti-communist. Shared cultural narratives. The Turner Diaries. I told you a little bit last lecture about what the Turner Diaries was. This is a book. It's widely known to be a white supremacist book, and it's about a guy who wants to start a race war. And so white guy named Turner, and he basically builds a truck bomb and he parks it in front of a federal building. This becomes the inspiration for Timothy McVeigh, 1995, Oklahoma's bomber. And guess what book he wrote about instead? The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries is an example of how there's a shared cultural narrative. We're going to have a second Civil War. You hear about that all the time. Second, you'll hear people say this. We're going to have a second Civil War. All this stuff. What they're trying to do is they're accelerations. They're trying to do these acts of terrorism to trigger a war that in the chaos, they think that they will come out on top. Genocide. I already defined for you genocide, right? We talked about how the Soviets carried it. We talked about 1970s prison recruitment. So in the 1970s, a lot of these groups started to recruit out of prison. So you get the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. This is a white supremacist prison gang. On the outside is the Aryan Nation. That's kind of like, imagine it's kind of like the street gang versus the prison gang version. Now, the Aryan Brotherhood is a racist gang. But oftentimes you'll see that these racial ideology gives way to business, i.e. they're criminals. So they're okay with doing business with the Mexican mafia, because they need drug supply or stuff like that. Now, their enemy in the prison system is the Black Guerrilla family. There's this famous incident in San Quentin prison in the 1960s. And what you started to see was things were getting racialized in the civil rights era, where people were racial identities were starting to get activated. You saw that come into the prison system as well. And so the lore is, and you don't know if this stuff is made up or whatnot, but there was a famous incident in San Quentin prison in which black prisoners raped white prisoners. And so for protection, they formed the Aryan Brotherhood as a counter to what was going on in the system. I've already told you about the ethno state that they were fantasizing about creating. Okay, the order. these groups started creating specialized internal, like their own special forces units. So the order was one of these groups. And these groups would have things like their own military training. Uh, it was founded by a guy named Matthews. So read about that in the blue. They did fundraising through robbery and counterfeit. So in the 1980s, you started to see a lot more armored truck robberies, bank robberies, things like this that traced back to white supremacist groups. They're obviously very interested in weapons, weaponry. They would engage in distribution of the proceeds. And they would set up, they had like chapters, white supremacist chapters all over the country. They set up a thing called Liberty Net, or there was the internet. Liberty Net would be like a virtual computer. They could tap into a chat before it was like white web. And they could share white supremacist literature and then distribute that white supremacist literature. So this is before the internet. This is pre-internet. So some of those proceeds were going to buying and setting up things like Liberty Net. They put out assassination lists. You'll see ISIS put out target lists that can be individual people or targets such as, say, the Wall of the Americas was one. Anybody know the Wall of the Americas? Okay, so up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or well, no, it's Minnesota, yeah, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities, right? It's really very cold. Like, so what's your activity to do in the winter if you want to get out with your family? You go to this giant wall, the Wall of the Americas. It's this massive thing. So it's basically like indoor thing. And you can walk around and gossip with your family, a good time, right? Well, ISIS at one point put the Wall of the Americas on a list of terrorist attacks. So ISIS decentralized effort. What they want is for some person who's practically self-radicalized online in the United States to go on there, decide they're self-radicalized, look at their target list and say, "Oh, I know, I know." To a certain extent, groups like the Order created, period ago, they created specific hit lists or assassinations. And they had cellular structure. So let's talk about Liberty. They were early adoption of network tools and personal computers in the late 70s and 80s. You all think of computers as computers. I'm just going to tell you just my life and my personal experience. I grew up in a town. This is where your strawberries are. I was generally the only white guy there. I exaggerate now by much. My schools were always 86%. It was a wonderful place to grow up. But in the 1980s, computers were really different. I didn't know that. It's only when I went to the rich white places now, stuff like that. And I had no concept how their economy worked. Like, I really did not. I was like, what do they do over there? Because in Watsonville, we're farmers, right? My dad's a school teacher, so I understood that. And there's farming in my town. Like, my town produced stuff. Everybody in Aptos seemed to be a dentist or a doctor selling each other services. I was like, when do they actually produce stuff? I didn't know, like, I didn't understand. They had computers. That was like an early thing. It was not ubiquitous to have a computer in the 1980s. It was very expensive to have a computer, and the computer you bought for $2,000 had, and $2,000 was a lot more, had a fraction of the capacity of more computers today. You don't even think. It used to be that a mobile phone or a tablet is a sign of wealth. Today, if I go to a restaurant and I see a small child on a tablet, I do not think wealth. I think poverty. Because that's what people do when they don't want to deal with their kid. And that's how they put them on the way. And that's become ubiquitous. And I should have known this earlier. I didn't realize until I realized that Steve Jobs, when he invented, got that out. He said, "Your daughter must be really." He goes, "Are you crazy?" The rich people are letting their kids go on tablets. They're giving those things away. They know those things. It's not those things. They know how to take those things. It's hijacking your brain right now. How many of you are on a laptop, probably be taking notes better and remembering the material from the lecture better, not on a laptop? I'm not going to make that decision for you. But handwriting notes is better for you. A lot of these things have become ubiquitous, and they're now associated. The people who designed them to distract. Ask yourself. I ask myself this question. I have a Twitter account. I get a dopamine hit every time I put out a publication and I put it out on Twitter. So I still have it. Right? I get a dopamine hit. Black behind this article. And it's been a wonderful resource. Well, this is my really speaking of women calling it. It is hijacking our attention. Read books on paper or like a Kindle, which is a dedicated electronic device that won't let you do other stuff like surf the web and stuff like that. Be careful. We all have the attention span of gnats. They call it brain rot. It's like we all have a 7-second attention span. It's bad. And I put myself in this category. I'm not being judgmental. Well, I am being judgmental, but of myself. Throw that in that day. So these guys were early adopters. This was not this technology. So before there was the World Wide Web, before there was the information superhighway invented by Al Gore, we all laugh at that. What did Al Gore actually do for the internet? Once he gets derided for having said, I invented the internet. Well, what did he actually do? Does anybody know what he actually did for the internet? You would not have the internet today. I can say that's true. He did not write the Union Code with TCP/IP proposals. Well, there it says that there aims for legislation that on the expansion of the ARPA and receive allows American actors of incident government. ARPANET was a military classified information network that was used by universities and military to essentially share information on nuclear stuff, research, all kinds of stuff. Everything great in your life was being funded from the US government, federal grant. It was given to a professor, and the professor was like, hey, I'm going to get $1,000. And then it becomes a central military ARPANET. And then they convert ARPANET to what you know now of as the World Wide Web. Basically, you have the internet today because a Tennessee Al Gore put money together to convert ARPANET to internet as you know it today. This was all before that. Personal computers were really expensive. They had really limited use. Yeah, you could do spreadsheets, you could do your own accounting and stuff like that. We had really use cases. But what they did was they realized that they could talk into chat boards and make specific communications from the modem. Do you guys know what a modem is? Have you guys ever heard the sound? Does anybody know what that is? Raise your hand if you know the sound. Do you know it from old recordings, or did you ever actually experience? You're growing up starting to talk about a dollar. Yeah. So, in the earliest days of the internet, when you could access it, your computer needed a way to talk to the phone line. So there was a little box, swap, typically 7, or eventually they built them in the computers. It was called a modem. And the modem would basically through tones talk across that phone line and trade information. It was incredibly slow. Okay, very slow. But there was this distinctive annoying sound it would make. It would take up your phone line. You couldn't get another phone call while that thing was running, while you were surfing the internet. And that was how you first got on the 1990s. Now they had been using modems. This was the internet of the late 80s and early 1990s. So they were getting computers. They had like $3,500 startup costs to get these chapters going, but they were getting them computers so that they could disseminate white supremacist propaganda and also communicate with each other. Or use robberies and counterfeiting to fundraise. They did a robbery campaign. They targeted porn stores. Why? Because pornography is bad. Therefore, we're robbing the evil people. You'll see this also amongst the Islamic extremists. They'll say, oh, well, we've decided that pornography is bad, or this is bad, or liquor store is bad, therefore robbing them is acceptable. They targeted banks, and they targeted armored cars. So counterfeiting was also a mechanism by which the revolution, they would wage war on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is an interesting institution. It's essentially kind of our version of a central bank. It's kind of quasi-private, kind of public, but at its core, who decides who is going to be the Federal Reserve Chair? The president decides who the Federal Reserve Chair is. And then he's got long 12-year terms. Just real quick, look up what the term of the Federal Reserve, chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's 7 now? Yeah. The idea being was you wanted to have a steady hand in economic theory. Yes. So years, but you mean what's to a current additional term. Yeah. I sometimes I think it was better in the old days of the 12-year term. Because the idea was you wanted steady hand economic theory. If you give a politician control of interest rates, what will they do with interest rates? If you give a politician control of the interest rate, what will they do with interest rates? Yeah. Well, how do you get better interest rates? You lower. Okay. What happens when you lower interest rates? What happens to inflation? Money gets cheaper. Everything goes up in price. Credit is easier to get, so everything goes up in price. So you get inflation. Okay. In the United States, during that stagflation period in like the late 1970s, early 1980s, we had massive inflation. I think it got up to 18%. You guys were whining about 8%. The early 1980s under Reagan, and the late 70s under Carter, inflation was massive. There's a Reserve Chairman named Paul Volcker. I want to tell you a quick story about Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker, he is a fine. He was that kind of there. He was this big, tall guy. Comes appointed Federal Reserve Chairman, and he says, Canada, he got those interest rates up to like 20-some% higher. He jacked up the interest rate so high, everybody in America hated his guts at the time. But then he got inflation under control. He got inflation so under control, we didn't have inflation again for 40 years. That's how under control he got inflation. Only in the last 4 or 5 years post-COVID, after a massive pandemic and supply chain disruptions and stimulus to try to keep the economy from collapsing after we potentially shut it down. It's a public health measure. Only after that did you see inflation. That's how under control all Volcker and the Federal Reserve. That is steady hand. Now, everybody said, I don't like Paul Volcker jacking up the interest rate, and it's 20%, 30% for you to buy a house. They would have fired him and said, what would happen to inflation? So, real quick story about Paul Volcker. There was a guy who was observing Paul Volcker before he gets appointed to the Federal Reserve, and he realizes Paul Volcker is sitting there with his feet up. Here's like one of the top bankers in America. Federal government. He's got his feet up, and you can see his sock line. Notice how I got my socks pulled up? Well, his was bunched down here. And the guy said, one thing my mother always told me was, pull up your socks. Well, Paul Volcker was a big, tall guy, sitting back in a chair in the middle of one of these federal banks with his feet up up on the table and his socks bunched up, doesn't care. He said, that was a better. I knew Paul Loper doesn't care what you think. He's going to do the right thing. He doesn't care what you think. That's steady hand. So the idea of giving somebody a long appointment that can't be undone for 12 years and say, hey, go to town, unless we decide you're crazy, mentally seeing things that aren't there, you're in charge. So sometimes in democratic systems, we'll put somebody in charge, and it almost seems undemocratic because their term is so long. We're going to do it because their plan is steady. We will panic. Every election, we panic. We the people. What you want is steady hand accountability. Of the three branches of government, which one holds the highest? There's three branches of government: the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. Of those three, which typically holds the highest? Maybe changing it. What? What? It may be changing now, but typically no. Supreme Court, the judicial, which is the least democratic of all three branches. The judicial. It's lifetime appointment. There's an old saying in political science. Watching legislation be made, it's like watching sausage. You may like how it tastes at the end. You don't want to see it get made. Because it's a nasty process. That's the legislation. The legislature is a nasty process. Yet it is the most democratic of all our institutions. And yet you may like these laws that we come up with. If you saw all the nasty stuff that went into them, you might not like it. But the Federal Reserve said, I want you to understand the institution. White supremacists attacking the Federal Reserve as an institution. And they believed that their counterfeiting was to attack that institution. They distributed the money from counterfeit to chapters around the country, and it was never fully recovered. They engaged in assassinations. The radio host, Alan Burr, the Jewish radio host, he was basically anti-Baptist in what he was talking about on the air. I think it's funny that like we're talking about Antifa. There are some people. Antifa as that sort of very decentralized. It's leftist, kind of extremist. These leftists are very limited in number. But the truth is, all Americans are anti-fascist in the sense of fascism is anti-democratic, anti-rule of law. So when you start to hear politicians talk about, well, if the president does it, it's not wrong. That's what Richard Nixon said. Richard Nixon said this in a very famous interview, the Frost interview, after he had resigned. And every American said it. He is the law. And that's a problem. The American Constitution is about setting up checks and balances. Pattern of life surveillance. So, what does that mean, pattern of life surveillance? That's where they kill. Yes, they surveil. Every morning he gets up at this time of day. Every day he goes to work along this route. Exactly. It makes it, once you have pattern of life on somebody and you want to kill them, it becomes a lot easier to do. Now, I always do a little aside in this part of the conversation. Particularly to women, be careful with what you share online. If, for example, you have a buddy that shares the exact GPS map, well, and time and day, and you post that online, and you tell the whole world exactly when you will be in the remote part of the safe park on your run. Be careful. Now, this just doesn't just apply to the woman, but I want you to pay special attention because I don't want anything bad to happen to anybody. Let's take an American base in Afghanistan. Everybody's got these fitness trackers, right? Well, they don't share personal information. They only share the aggregated information. Well, they share one of those digital things, like all the places you can go to house. One of those places was a remote spot in Afghanistan. Where do the soldiers in Afghanistan run? On the perimeter of the base. Which means the Taliban have an exact GPS map where they can put a sniper and target an American soldier where he goes on that run around U.S. Army base. Or that forward, or what do they call it, forward operating base? Yeah, see the problems here? We don't realize what's being done for. How many of you have actually read end user license agreement on every single piece of software you clicked OK on and installed on your computer? You have. You are the one guy. No, it sounds sarcasm. I figured. So if no one is ready, and if everybody just clicks OK blindly, this is probably an area that screams for regulation. One of those regulations doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use the data at all. It might be you have to give us 4 or 5 bullet points of what you did last week. No, shit. 4 or 5 bullet points of what the key things being done with the data all. And standardize that way. You raise your hand. Go ahead. Yeah. And I'm like, the only reason I remove it is I'm already suspicious of the software. Yes. And like, if you're not, no one's going to be good if you have dissertation on what they're downloading. So, yeah, I'm going to be different. And, I'm continuing concerned, for example, when Wikipedia has AI. You know, like, what is AI analysis of your document right for it and give you a summary? Like, well, what if I have PDF that is like public discussion? Because what you feed each one is out can be prompted back out. Okay. So Al Burke was assassinated in his front yard by a MAC 10. You guys know what a MAC 10 is? Yeah, it's a small submachine gun. Or weapon barrel. It's interesting. It's a spray and pray kind of gun. It's gonna pump out a ton around very, very quickly. I mean, yeah, it's really it puts out a lot of rounds. Now, why is that something we pay attention to? Because in this case, they may have went to the Allenberg, but how many people will get killed in a crossfire? 500, what? 33, this yeah. In Mexico, assassins or sicarios used to be highly trained. As the drug war moved on, you got people who just have very different. Yeah, you'll see these infantry and light battles, but these are guys who have very trained. They're not going to have the level of training as say Austin, who was in the for the early Scottios in like the 90s, they would aim for the door handle. They were doing an assassination in the fall, so they would only kill the person in the driver's. Like it was that precise. That has long since passed. So the idea of a lone wolf. So if you're going to follow around on Twitter, one of the things that she will regularly bring up is lone wolf. Are you sure? We bandy about this term lone wolf. It's lone wolf. And in that one incident, it might be an individual acting alone in that one incident. do not know the support structure they had behind them. So I gave you the example of Nadia, a Houdini boy, killed and set ambush for 2 U.S. law enforcement, San County Sheriff's deputies, killed one, wounded the other. And he likely also, a month earlier, killed a federal protective police officer at a federal building. Just took a hot shot at him. He was in communication with another Boogaloo boy who infiltrated a Black Lives Matter protest, fired AK-47 rounds, 7 AK-47 rounds into a police station in Kenosha, Wisconsin during the Black Lives Matter, in the hopes of making those protests move violent and inspire bigger response. If you just look at Canioto Matthew, or in the immediate event, you go, this is a lone wolf. What you realize is he's talking to a coordinating online who does have a network. The term helps to keep the movement out of the public consciousness. So that's one of Ballou's key points here. Let's move on to the next lecture.